thing we would recognize as a police force. What was policing was basically done by sort of private action. But in particular, if you look at cases like England before the Norman Conquest, or medieval Iceland, or medieval Ireland, you find various cases where there wasn't really anything in the way of a monopoly state. You had legal services. Take the case of Iceland. You could sign it. There was a legislature, so it wasn't completely competitive. There was a single legislature, but you could sign up with who you wanted your representative in the legislature to be, and you didn't have to change your location to do it. So it's like, you could just say, suppose that the analog in our country would be if you could switch who your representative in Congress was without switching what state or what district you live in, and there was no executive branch in Iceland. There was no president. There was no there were no police. There was this legislature, but you could sign up with. And your representative also provided sort of protection services, but you could switch from one protector to another without changing your location. So it had a competitive aspect. They didn't have anything that we would call a state. Likewise, people talk about the Wild West. The Wild West really wasn't quite as wild as people say. At least many parts of it weren't. And although nominally the United States government was the authority out there, there were lots of places where the United States government just wasn't anywhere to be seen in terms of actual representatives, and you find these local groups. Historically, they get called vigilante groups, but if you look at how some of them operated, the vigilante groups, they would capture a criminal, try him, and sometimes they would find him not guilty and let him go, which shows that they weren't the way you sort of picture vigilante groups as being. And there was places also where there are no judges, and so if two people have a dispute, they'd often sort of each side would pick someone that they trusted to arbitrate the dispute. Those two people would pick a third one, and they'd arbitrate the dispute. And lots of places people had to find ways of ensuring legal cooperation for themselves because the state wasn't there. And of course, once you've got society and the economy going, then the state moves in and says, "Oh, okay, now I'm in charge of all this." But they often, the state really isn't the source of order in society. It just sort of comes along as a parasite on top of that order. There's a great line from, I think it's the British anarchist Colin Ward, saying, "Anarchy is the cement that holds society together." It's voluntary exchange is or Thomas Paine at the beginning of the second half of Rights of Man says that the chief source of order in society is not government. The chief source of order in society is the fact that human beings cooperate, A, because we're naturally social beings, and B, because it's in our self-interest to cooperate. And those two factors lead to most of the order in society, Paine thought. And then Paine wasn't an anarchist. He thought that you did need government, but he thought that most of the order in society would survive even if you didn't have it. And part of his evidence was, he said, well, look at during the American Revolution, when the British government really wasn't operating, but the local colonial governments really hadn't gotten their act together particularly either. And he says, well, people still brought their goods to market and so forth. Society, did fairly well during the Revolution, in the areas where there wasn't actual fighting. Society was going on as before. Actually, Sir Edmund Burke, oddly enough, makes the same point in his speech on conciliation with the colonies in the Parliament. He says, we thought that without government, the colonies would quickly run into collapse and come crying back to us, and they're not. And we'd better make an agreement with them quickly before they decide that anarchy is tolerable. So there have been a number of historical cases. There really is no case of any so-called public good that hasn't been provided privately at one time or another.
In fact, Murray Rothbard argues that Burke was at one time himself an anarchist.
Yeah, Burke has there's an early piece of Burke's called The Vindication of Natural Society, where he argues in favor of anarchism. And then Burke later claimed that this was a joke. There was a satire against Bolingbroke, and some people thought it was a satire against Rousseau. But other people have noted that it doesn't really look exactly like a satire. And there are some interesting similarities between it and some of his other early writings that people don't think are satirical. So it's hard to know exactly what he was doing. It may not have been entirely sincere, but he may have been sort of playing with ideas that he was, at least to some extent tempted by, or he's trying to see where they would lead. At any rate, it seems too similar to some of his early writings to be completely satirical. On the other hand, it is in some tension with some of his early writings, and so it's hard to know what to make of it. But as a satire, it's not very, it's not very interesting as a satire. Whereas it's a pretty good, it's a pretty good argument as it stands. So some people call him sort of the first, call it the sort of the first modern, anarchist manifesto. I'm not sure whether it really is the first. It's so far hard to find first, because you can find various people, earlier who always, you can always find someone earlier who seems to have had some part of the idea. But Burke does seem to have oddly at least contributed something interesting to this literature.
Burke's vindication of natural society is on LouRockwell.com. You can just put Burke into Google there and find it. Murray Rothbard argued that it was, not satire. Although this is, I guess, the typical Burke scholar agrees with the satirical point. Yeah,
the majority view among Burke scholars is that it's satirical. Although Isaac Kramnik, in his biography of Burke called "The Rage of Edmund Burke: Portrait of an Ambivalent Conservative," he has a section where he talks about Rothbard's article, and although he doesn't go as far as Rothbard, he thinks that Rothbard had a good point, and he thinks that. So he makes the case by comparing the Vindication with other early writings of Burke that no one ever reads. He makes the case that it couldn't have been as satirical as most Burke scholars think. But I haven't seen any Burke scholars really responding to Kramnik's argument in there, because I still see, when you see it in anthologies of Burke's early writings, the introduction always just says, "Oh, and this is a satirical work," and doesn't seem to be aware of this other argument.
Roderick, you wrote a famous article in defense of anarchism. Walter Block calls it the best article ever written in favor of anarchism.
Replies to 10 objections to libertarian anarchism. It's on Mises.org. It's on LouRockwell.com. So if you just Google Roderick Long objections libertarian anarchism, some combination of those words, it'll probably come up. And what I did was I ran through a bunch of the standard objections to libertarian anarchism and tried to give arguments against them. This was a talk that I gave at the Mises Institute. I think it was the time I was a mystery speaker at a conference.
Roderick Long, thanks so much for being with us today. Take a look at his archive at Mises.org. Take a look at his archive at LouRockwell.com, and especially take a look at his refutation of 10 objections to anarchism. Roderick, thank you.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to The Lou Rockwell Show, produced by LouRockwell.com, the best-read libertarian website in the world. If you'd like to advertise on this podcast or on the website, email advertise@LouRockwell.com. And thanks for listening.